I mean,
you can probably
for years out.
totally sure. So I don't know what's easier, AWS or
He's coming out.
I train your child.
Yes, for sure.
Looking at the emblem, it reminds me of InfraGard. It's not, but it is.
The solution architect guy works closely.
I think this is our proof for today. Okay, if he calls, or if you could let me know, I could run down there and
He's
help
not,
get him badged
he
in.
just kept
Okay.
he's not gonna make it.
He's not gonna make it.
I think this is our crew today, Brian.
Sounds like a plan.
Thank you all very much for coming out again. So Brian's gonna be here talking, security and ransomware, this month for you all. We had just been talking, before we got started in here. Some of the people are coming in for their first time, doesn't really know, who's who. We're gonna quickly go around, say who we are, where we're at, anything else interesting. So, Nick Lawson, I'm a solutions architect with AWS assigned to customers here in Louisville, Kentucky.
Well, hold on, who's this lovely lady with you, Nick Lawson?
Unfortunately for her, I drug my wife out. I'm actually on PTO this week and we were out running errands and unfortunately got a little late, so I told her she had to come and listen to AWS, so.
I'm gonna be an expert. And what are we talking about?
Ransomware, there you go. Fantastic, welcome. I'm Steve Schoen with Humana. So happy to host you guys again this week. This month. This is our second one here, and we look forward to doing plenty more of these meetups with everybody. So just excited to learn some more about AWS capabilities. So.
Nathan Hiscock, clean slate, and I work in pre-sales engineering and in the consulting world as an AWS partner.
Nur Mandari, K-Force, Humana, ITM&A, integration, so.
Bill Dunsing, solutions architect for AWS.
Patrick Dineville, an account manager for AWS.
Travis Rose, I don't know if you can see past that pillar over there. I'm a data analyst for Brightspring Health Services over on the east end of Louisville. Just learning how to use AWS and all that stuff in my spare time, so.
I'm Leland Johnson. I'm a solutions architect with AWS.
I'm Sean Burns. I work as an internal auditor for Humana. I'm very much a novice about everything AWS and anything tech, but I'm looking to broaden my horizon. So whatever I might say, but might sound pretty ignorant, but please forgive me. Yeah.
Andrew Korlick, software engineer for Google.
I'm Cadet. I am also with AWS as an operations manager and support engineering.
And I am Brian Stucker. So I'm a senior security and compliance solutions architect at AWS. I mainly sit on the global public sector security team, but at the same time, I do various things. I live here locally in Louisville, so security is a passion of mine, as you will hopefully find out through this presentation. I've been in the industry for about 17 years. I say the industry, the cybersecurity industry, since back when I graduated from college at UK. So if you're a UK fan, that's me as well. So before I get into it, can I go through some of the initial intro slides that we have? I'm sure the slide deck is working, of course. So Horace, overall, thank you. Again, thanks for Humana hosting. Definitely appreciate it. Again, as Nicholas stated, the vision for the group is having these monthly meetings, building community, gaining skills, but then also, you know, it's member driven from you guys. So, and we'll get into that here within the next slide for us, like what that might look like. But as we mentioned earlier, after this, there is the Troll Pub. So, you know, stay tuned for that after we get done chatting. Maybe we can continue the conversation, especially if you're so enthralled with ransomware and want to continue that discussion or any other security topics. Happy to entertain those and talk through those. over maybe a beverage at Troll Pub.
Well, ransomware always makes me thirsty, Brian.
Well, see, we like minds. So again, future topics that are already on the slate, as you can see up here. But at the same time, if you guys have more topics, send them in. Happy to have other presentations from you guys that you guys want to talk about, or again, it's community drawn. So what are the interests that you guys have?
Surveys every month after the meetup, so please make sure to add on whatever topics you want to discuss. And next month, our very own Leland is going to come talk to us about Kubernetes on AWS, specifically using EKS.
Yeah, this one is close to my heart. I am a certified business continuity disaster recovery professional. Yeah, because of the travel needs, I stopped doing it. I didn't want to travel for a while, so.
So tonight's session will be particularly interesting to you.
That's what
Okay.
I'm here.
And then EKS next month, there's a lot of people that have shown some interest in that topic as well too, so looking forward to that topic.
And I'll try to dance around this column going back and forth. So if you see me moving back and forth, it's not just me dancing. It's trying to keep you guys engaged, but maybe a little show and tell might work as well. So without further ado, I'll kick it off. So ransomware protection and recovery. That's what we're talking about this month. If you guys weren't aware, October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So that's why I thought it might be prudent back when this started to maybe do a security focus session here in the month of October. So being a security specialist, I love security in the sense of educating people and making sure people are aware of the latest trends and best practices. Kind of what I'm going to be going over today is kind of setting the stage. What is ransomware specifically? But then also diving into some of the best practices for protection. Now, this can translate over to whether it's using AWS or just in general, like what are those best practices? I will focus on some aspects, of course, from AWS as far as like what are some of the services you could use. But really my intent is like being security focused is understanding what are those best practices. That translates across the spectrum for what you can be doing to help enable and prevent ransomware or disaster recovery. Also at the very end, I'll showcase some where can you go for future learnings, some resources. There's a lot of resources out there in this space, and I'll highlight a few that I've talked about throughout the session. I know we have about 45 minutes roughly, so I'll kind of skip through some slides fairly quickly. At the same time, stop, interrupt me, ask questions. If you want to dive in deep on a particular subject, this is your time to do that. I really want to hit on the best practices for ransomware protection. So there's like 5 core best practices, and so I'll spend a lot of the time on that. Again, that's what I call the meat and potatoes. If you're going to do anything, at least do those first 5. There's other aspects that I'll tie into for backup and recovery, but at least if you can do those first 5, then that is a great start to the discussion. So let's level set. What is ransomware? Anyone want to give what they think might be an answer?
I think it's a program that encrypts all your, what is it called, the files that you own, and then it asks you for money in order to decrypt it.
That is a very common aspect. So again, ransomware is a business model that usually unauthorized users leverage. There's a wide range of technologies that go through it. A lot of the stuff that is common, my slides just disappeared on my screen, is what you mentioned in the sense of users actually what they call having their files encrypted. Now, there's a couple different ways that usually occurs. Usually a user account access controls get locked out, or maybe it's just the files get encrypted and they get exfiltrated, which then calls through maybe pay me this money, otherwise I'm going to release this these files. However, those are traditional ransomware. One thing I do want to highlight is on AWS, one of the things that we generally see is not so much of that traditional ransomware that you generally see associated with Windows, but it's also more around security events around to leaked credentials. And I'll get more into that. So what I mean by that is the least credentials. You know, you hear about AWS, you hear about, anything, it's around who has access to what data. A lot of the times with IAM, you might create user credentials that are long-lived. So those secrets, those credentials, having those credentials leaked, which then causes a compromise in your data, is what we see sometimes also occurring within a ransomware scenario. That's also one of why it's very important to not use long-lived credentials wherever necessary. So I'll dive a little bit more into that as far as one of the big preventions, but just want to highlight that was spot on for ransomware. But then from an AWS side, a lot of it is focused on those credentials themselves. Sorry, my laptop keeps on jumping the screens for some reason. So why is ransomware effective? Again, this highlights to some of the top 10, aspects. So a lot of times it comes down to, for whatever reason, maybe it's due to risk mitigation, maybe it's due to not having enough people or process, but a lot of organizations don't end up patching. Why is that a thing? Well, a lot of times what happens is the criminals or the people that are taking effect from a ransomware aspect, they'll take advantage of this. If you don't patch your systems, there's a critical 0 day. A lot of the times when a 0 day, let me explain what a 0 day is. It's effectively an opportunity to have access to those systems that has not been patched and get you the highest level of access. When that is usually released, generally software providers patch it. But if you don't apply that patch, generally that's already been out there in the wild and there's proof of concepts for how to exploit that. Those attackers are taking advantage of the fact that, hey, there's this known vulnerability and oh, by the way, there's this proof of concept. Let me modify my ransomware to now take advantage of this latest vulnerability. So that's why you see a lot of that from an attack vector perspective. Going through here, other things that you also see when you talk through ransomware itself. So that's the initial vector. But I mentioned early on that this is ransomware and disaster recovery. Because what happens if you have your files encrypted and you're still compromised? Well, they don't have access to the data because the data is encrypted at rest, so they can't access the data, but now you don't have access to your data either because they've double encrypted it. And so now what do? Well, it's a disaster recovery scenario. So why is this important? Because again, that's another reason why it's effective, because maybe you haven't actually going down to this bottom point. Organizations aren't necessarily backing up their data. We're not necessarily testing through their disaster recovery scenarios. Again, testing is a key piece. You can back up all day and every day, but if you don't test to ensure that you can actually recover that, it doesn't mean anything if you can't actually ensure that those backups are good. Does it contain the data that you expect it to? And are you able to recover in a timely fashion how you expect to recover and get operations back to where they need to be?
Can you even recover? That was,
Yeah,
the challenge.
exactly.
That was interesting because I know traditionally, like everywhere I've been before, when we talk about DR and DR testing, we're really talking about a site is unavailable, right? Like a tornado knocked over a data center. Our DR tests we were never talking about, we just don't have access to the data, right? So this is a different aspect to DR than what I've heard talked about often.
Yep. And another, interesting, tidbit is, COVID brought a rise in a lot of things. And why was that? So, with COVID, a lot of people started working from home. We also saw a surge in cryptocurrency to the point of, I forget your name, but the gentleman over here had mentioned, encrypting files and asking for money. Generally, that was through the form of cryptocurrency. Why was that? One, it's harder to trace, but two, the value of it kept on increasing exponentially over that period of time. So again, you ask for one cryptocurrency today might be worth 1,000 tomorrow, depending on how things fluctuate. So again, it was very profitable at the end of the day. So next thing I like to kind of look at is ways to address this. So first, level set NIST cybersecurity framework. Also common referred to as the CSF. Why do I say this? the cybersecurity framework is a consistent model, especially used within here in the US, which hopefully you guys are all at least based here in the US since I'm giving it the talk here in Louisville. But at the same time, it is a common aspect that you see across the industry, to even include multinational. What I mean by that is where it comes down to is these 5 aspects, you know, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So the core aspects of the cybersecurity framework are in these 5 things. So things that you can do to help prevent, all align to these. The things that I'm going to talk through today is mainly going to be on the top aspect, which is identifying. I'm going to go through some of the protection things. Again, those are like the 5 best things you might be able to do. But at the very end, the bottom one, recover. So at the end of the day, that's where that disaster recovery comes in. Because even if you do have an incident, and this is across all security events, not just ransomware, but ransomware is the biggest prevalent where you need to use a recovery scenario. But across all security incidents, more than likely you're going to want to recover something. So how do you do that? So I'll talk through that at the very end, because that is a key critical piece on all security events, is being able to recover at the same time. So let's start off to begin with, why AWS? So one of the things of AWS is we have a lot of partner security products. So again, a lot of common users will have other things in their environment that they're generally used to using. For example, CrowdStrike or Trend Micro. Another aspect is maybe it's a firewall aspect that you're, if we go in through the cybersecurity model with a detection, maybe you use Palo Alto firewalls, maybe you use Fortinets, or maybe you use Cisco firewalls. Those are all partners, especially if you're looking at like the detection aspect at the network layer. But that's why we have a huge, wide assortment of partner security products. The other thing is GuardDuty and Security Hub is another big core aspect if we're looking at the detect and identify phases of the cybersecurity framework. What I mean by that is GuardDuty, for example, is a threat detection managed service that runs in your environment that helps you take advantage of detecting threats and anomalous activity by leveraging core logs that are within your environment without having to manually enable them. Some of those include like DNS logs as far as who's doing what lookups. Think of that as that initial command and control. So why is this relevant for ransomware? That initial instance gets compromised and it starts doing that encryption aspect and sending the data back to these malicious actors. Well, that can be identified through detecting those threats through a known threat actor list of that data starting to get exfilled and to that endpoint. And that's where GuardDuty is at. Security Hub, why is it good? Again, it helps to automate those checks in a central pane of glass to provide that visibility across all your accounts. So again, if you have multiple accounts, and I'll get into this as a best practice, that separation, how can you centralize and have that visibility? Security Hub is one of those ways to do, but also it helps to push those findings out to maybe an existing partner product. So maybe you have Splunk as a SIM. So leverage Security Hub, push those findings to Splunk, and your security operations team has already, known their process to enable it, and you've enabled them by getting additional detail from AWS into their known security operations paradigm that they're working through. I'll skip through this aspect. This is more on disaster recovery. I'll kind of circle back to this at the very end when we touch more on recovery. Just want to make sure we get through some of the core aspects, such as the 5 best practices for ransomware protection. Again, this is what I mentioned. If you take home anything from today's discussion, it's going to be these 5 aspects. So what are they? 5 main things you can do. Patch and harden your systems. Continuously strive for least privilege access. Use a multi-account strategy with network segmentation. Develop an incident response plan. More likely than not, you might have done everything, but if you don't have a response plan on how to action it, it doesn't kind of do you any good because that gets to the last one, doing self-assessments. everyone can improve. Security is not perfect. No one is gonna have a perfect score all the time. That's guaranteed. Things are changing every day, all day. So there's no way that you can be guaranteed to have a perfect score all the time. A lot of times when I talk through security, I like to talk through risk mitigation. Is what is an acceptable risk for you and your business operations needs? That changes. Each department within a business might have a different risk mitigation profile that they want to do. Maybe one wants to push everything publicly because they want to ensure their customers have quick and easy access to data. Maybe another one wants to ensure everything's locked down because it contains intellectual property and, you know, secrets that they don't want other people to look up. Those are two different risk, you know, focus areas between two different business units that might be in the same organization. So having that conversation from a risk perspective is paramount to help drive these aspects. So let's start off with the first one. Patch and harden your systems. What does that mean? Or how could you do that in AWS? So I kind of talked about it a little bit earlier. You know, there's 0 days. That's a threat vector for customers to maybe have attackers coming in. So how can you prevent that from occurring? You patch your system and you harden your system. So those known vulnerabilities are addressed early and often. Some of the services that are available out there, at least on AWS, is Amazon Inspector. So Amazon Inspector is a managed service that allows you to look at the actual environments for CVEs, common vulnerability exposures lists. So for example, that might be the latest vulnerability that was just released. And then looking in your environment and saying like, oh, hey, I'm susceptible to this latest 0 day in 50% of my workloads because the update failed. Well, that's a key indicator to know that, hey, I need to go out there and check and force that update to occur. Another one that kind of goes in with that is with the ECR image scanning. So Amazon Inspector can also look into the containers themselves at the different layers to understand, is there vulnerabilities that are associated within those layers? So that is a good dovetail for another next month with EKS running containers. If you're gonna be running containers, try to do the Amazon ECR image scanning. It helps protect you against vulnerabilities in your containers that you have running in your environment. Another thing is a Systems Manager, Patch Manager. So I talked about Amazon Inspector to detect those actual threats. Well, Systems Manager, the Patch Manager, can help you actually apply those patches. So I mentioned like maybe that patch didn't run in 50% of your environment. Well, Patch Manager can help you then proactively go through and set those patches to run. For example, maybe you have a dev environment and you have a production environment. You want to apply those patches right at the very beginning as soon as they are introduced in your dev environment on day one. Why do you want to do that, you might ask? Well, maybe, again, your risk profile says that I need to test that in dev to ensure that it doesn't impact my operations that I really care about for my business. So again, that goes back to the security focus and the risk mitigation approach, understanding what your business needs are. You do that first in your dev environment. Patch Manager then has, it works. You then have it set to go and deploy the patches in a completely separate production environment the next day. So again,
It doesn't relieve there's a lot of testing required. That is the burden of patching, and that's why people do not want to patch. It's taking away from your end users and business units.
and that's,
Different environments too.
and so that's why this is only one aspect of, the system. So some of the aspects, and I'll get into that, is how do you mitigate against that in the sense of, patching a system. And that might be through one avenue that I'll talk through here in a minute, is leveraging managed services, where the managed service automatically does the patching for you. So you don't just have to worry about the OS patching and the intrinsic operational value, because that's offloaded to, another operations team that's doing that. So again, this is, that risk management is what is acceptable for your organization. If you need to maintain the OS and the hardware and everything, then this is something that is more dear and true, and then you have to staff for it appropriately to ensure that you get all that testing done. But it also then helps do that prevention from a ransomware perspective. The second aspect is continuously striving for least privilege. What I mean by this is, again, I mentioned earlier on that on AWS, generally some of the compromises that we see from a ransomware perspective deal with credentials, long-lived credentials that are out there that have more access than what you think they should have access to. Number one thing, try to eliminate all static credentials. Minimize it. Everyone should be as strongly encouraged, federate everywhere when possible. For any human user that is going into your AWS system, make sure it's a federated user that is attached to a role. Why do I say this? Because with federation, you can at least ensure that those credentials are short-lived. Maybe it's only 24 hours. Great, but I'll tell you what, 24 hours is a heck of a lot better than having a long-lived credential that's out there for 365 or 2 or 3 years, and it's stuck in some repo, and then it gets compromised, and no one knew it was there. And all of a sudden, that credential had access to admin ****. That's going to be a very bad day. So minimize that. Federate where possible.
Another important reason why federating is important is like your HR processes are almost always tied to Active Directory, but HR may know nothing about your AWS accounts, right? So someone changes roles or they leave the company, you probably have an automated process to remove their credentials. There's a good chance your automated process would overlook your cloud provider, right? Unless your security team really has their stuff together, right? But by automating, federating with your, whatever your identity provider is, probably Active Directory, right? You're instantly protected from that aspect too, right? That's
Exactly. So it helps with the attrition. I say attrition in the sense of people change roles. Permissions should change based off the role they have. You know, all because you were, you know, an admin yesterday, and you switch job functions, and now you're on the security team. So you went from being an infrastructure admin and you were creating everything. Now you're on the security team and you're actually doing incident response. You probably shouldn't have the same permissions that you had on your previous role, and likely you got updated in HR. So if you can tie it to that, associate it that way, you can effectively scale your organization appropriately with your credential usage to, again, minimize the static credentials, minimize who has access, ultimately implementing that least privilege. One of the other tools that helps with that is IAM Access Analyzer. Why this is important is it helps you to scope down the actual access that is needed for your roles. And again, those roles are again in the policies that you have your users that are attached to, whether it's federating through or roles for actual application usage. The last thing I'll hit on as well, it kind of ties into the next slide, which is a multi-account structure. But utilizing service control policies, SCPs, at an organizational level, when you start practicing like a bigger region, you have multiple accounts, larger organizations, different structures. Again, think about like an Active Directory. You have a domain with your main force, and you have subdomains. Maybe you want to apply like GPOs only for specific OUs within that Active Directory domain. This is similar to that, where you are applying a binary policy to that organizational unit. What this generally is best practice is doing is saying, do not do this. For example, one of the biggest things is maybe within your compliance regime, you say that this particular type of data, for example, whether it's HIPAA related or whatnot, has to be processed within the US. I cannot use any other regions. So that's a binary policy. There is no potential unless it's under this case or unless it's this case. It is a binary decision. In that case being a binary decision, you put a service control policy that says, do not use any other regions aside from these regions that I'm allowed to use. If you put that in, that helps you to ensure that you have that least privilege, but also helps you meet compliance needs as well. So that is a key aspect for how these can kind of go together. I mentioned that multi-account aspect. So why is that important? A multi-account strategy and network segmentation helps minimize the least privilege, helps also have that blast radius perspective. So when we start talking about defense in depth, you segment your networks maybe on-prem, that's a best practice. Why not do that in the cloud as well? Each workload has a unique value. each user that needs access to that has a unique value. Federation that I talked about previously, you can then use that same federation to access all your workloads, but then it's scalable. So again, this is where the big core thing is it's scalable. So as your business needs grow, the foundation that you've put in place grows with it. What I mean by that is, as you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, there's those foundational aspects, whether it's that infrastructure, maybe it's that network, everything is tying into that core networking account. That's what your network team manages. No one else goes in there and has their hands on it and managing it. All the other accounts automatically connect to it when they get created. One of the things I do like to highlight on this is the Landing Zone Accelerator on AWS. This was recently announced back in DC Summit this year from AWS as a solution. That was in May of this year. Landing Zone Accelerator helps you to create a secure, compliant environment. It builds on top of other aspects like Control Tower, but it helps to address a lot of compliance needs. There's actually a HIPAA control best practices for healthcare that just got released. I say it just got released. It got released dev branch last night. It will go out into production tomorrow as a release version 1.2.1. I say that because I was involved in pushing it through. So if you go out there on the GitHub repo right now, you'll see the dev 1.2.1 and there's a healthcare best practices. So if you wanted to leverage that, you could implement things to apply to conform with HIPAA, C5 over in Germany. There's a whole list of compliance frameworks that it talks through. One of the fourth thing is having an incident response plan. So again, you can do everything in the world and everyone is gonna have a security incident at some point. It's not a question of, if, it's when. That's what I always like to say. So better be prepared. So why not set up that preparedness early and often? Do your incident response plan. What is this critical for? It helps you understand the process that you have in your organization. Who are the key touch points that you need to interact with when something happens? Do you need to get legal involved early and often? What is that trigger point to get legal involved? Do you need to notify the CEO or the board of directors? Are you a publicly traded company and you had a huge breach in customer information? Or is it just a small little breach in the sense of like someone defaced your website? But what is that process? Without an incident response plan, you don't know your appropriate level of action to take, who to notify, what are the steps to triage it, and ultimately the next step, which is recovery. So again, you can use some of the things that we have from an AWS side perspective, such as Guard Duty, Security Hub for detecting things. There's also, break glass roles that I'll touch into as far as getting into account access for last minute from a security operations perspective. But again, all these are tangential to you need to have the plan itself. And that plan is people and process. There's also technology, which we can help with, but you need the people and process.
Tabletop exercises at a minimum.
Yeah, and so that gets you led me right into number 5. So the self-assessments. One of the best ways to do a self-assessment is maybe doing a tabletop exercise. That tabletop exercises helps you understand, is there gaps in your coverage for your incident response plan? Or from if you're just trying to do a self-assessment, maybe on the technology side, some of the tools we have is the well-architected or Security Hub with the best practices, or even our security assessment solution that's posted on GitHub. These are all tools you can do to leverage and understand, am I doing what I think I should be doing? Has best practices changed? As I mentioned, threats are ever evolving day to day. So should your technology, so should your process, so should your everything else that you're doing. The only way to understand if you're evolving with those threats is by doing the self-assessments. That's why it rounds out the top 5.
And if I can here, love to throw in stories where this happens in the real world. So in a previous life, I was a software developer at a bank, won't throw out any names. We had a ton of process around what our disaster recovery solution was. If I needed a new VM, I had to request dual, our primary and our backup. I had to make sure that there was never cross traffic against the two, so I couldn't load split my application across the two. I had to make sure that if I was requesting tables, I also requested in our backup Oracle. We paid for backup Oracle license, every time we did a deployment, all of our binaries got deployed to both servers. We ensured that they weren't running on the secondary server. And every quarter, without fail, we had disaster recovery drills. And my group, every quarter for the 2 years that I was there, failed. So Saturday morning, everybody's getting on a conference bridge. The main data center that we were using gets turned off. Everything is down. We have 2, 4, and 8 hour marks that we have to hit. Come usually Sunday evening, we're going, okay, and we're done. And my whole group failed every time. Nobody cared. We had the process there. We knew it was supposed to happen. We ran the drills, which is what the company said they cared about. But if anything ever actually happened and we had to fall over into disaster recovery, everyone in the engineering group knew that it wasn't going to happen. And we had many months of failures to prove it wasn't going to happen.
That
So
happens because it depends on the industry, like financial or healthcare, especially financial. You are, getting audited. That's why you have your auditors, because a lot of people are, it's a lot based on that. You get a lot of fines, you need to adhere to it. The bottom line is, they look at if you have actually done it, or audit may prod it to fix it though, depending on the company. Otherwise, all you have to do is to execute and show evidence that you have done it.
right. So it is very, very important to not only exercise it, but make sure it works.
But then that also comes to, I think really hammers down to, maybe that was an acceptable risk for, the leaders in the company. Again, everything is subjective. Definitely take lessons learned, by all means, that's what I'm saying. But at the same time, understand that, everyone is different. So again, to me, it goes back to that risk mitigation aspect. Like, is that an acceptable risk? Did you just have to check the box? Or should the risk actually be like, oh my God, I can't actually recover from this. This is more critical. I need to ensure that I can actually go through with this. So different levels of risk, and
A
everyone
lot of
makes
things
their own decision.
pulling from each end, and
Yeah,
DR honestly becomes just checking the box most of the time. Unless something really bad happens, then it's at the president level or at the, CISO, CIO
Yeah.
level. Then it comes, then you have to do something.
Yep.
Or somebody's gonna get audited and they know they need to show evidence, and, you have maybe 1 month to fix it and, get it out because you need to show evidence to the auditors. That's when it takes, otherwise,
other priorities,
It's-
yeah.
a lot of, it needs to be baked into day-to-day operations when you're actually setting up your servers, setting up your systems. Even you talked about identity management or role-based. It is so hard when you're converting, especially to new systems. We're in the acquisition world, coming from smaller companies. It's so hard. We're trying to get them on, for example, Humana-based, and we have to talk about roles. They don't have enough people. They don't worry about roles. It's like, even from the world that I came in, I was there for 20 years, big company. You just tell people to set that person up just like that,
Yeah.
not based on what the needs, because people don't have time. They don't know what they need. They don't want to spend
And
time.
that's where some of those tools can come in to help you. So one of the things going back to that real quick, I'll touch on it, like Access Analyzer. You can look at audit trail events with Access Analyzer, the log events itself, and understand, is the permission policy that you've granted too permissive based off of the historical trends and the actions that have been performed by that user? So that's when you can start taking advantage of maybe these other tools, because maybe you don't have, the time and resources, to that point to really hone it in. So how can you make it easier? Leverage some of the tools that are there to help get that best practice approach to the least privilege, and you do what you think is the best guess. Copy my permissions. And then a month later, you go through and look at it and be like, wow, they're only doing this one function. They really don't need the same permissions as me. All right, let's create a new role and only give them those permissions. So it's an iterative approach to, that self-assessment aspect. That's one thing that applies directly from a self-assessment. You can go back in and do the least privilege, and again, continuously improve. That's the biggest thing, continuously improve. But with that, the last thing I'm gonna kind of dive into is the recovery aspect. So again, some of the best practices for, backup and recovery. Again, this was ransomware and disaster recovery. All security incidents, usually there's a recovery aspect of it. So how can you address that backup and recovery? So again, this is that final aspect. One of the things I want to, highlight is the biggest thing to form an effective strategy is understanding these things on the side. What is the most important type of data that you want to recover? Again, I'll point back to that risk mitigation that I was talking about. Everyone thinks their information is important, but what is important to that business unit? That is the biggest question, because they're ultimately responsible. Everyone's trying to appease someone. Everyone has a customer. Whether that customer is your shareholders, from like the board and the CEO's perspective, or maybe it's your own internal customer. But what is that data that you ultimately find is important that you have to do your job as a whole? Should the recovery of that data be prioritized over others? So this gets into that risk-based calculus. When you start pulling everyone together, you have more of a bigger meeting, especially if it's a centrally controlled environment from a data recovery perspective. Is your data more important than mine? Or is that person's data more important than mine? Who takes precedence when you're going through a disaster recovery scenario to get up first? Have an open and honest conversation with all the stakeholders. That is key and critical. What is an acceptable recovery time? So you're here in disaster recovery. You're generally here about RTO and RPO, recovery time objective and recovery point objective. What do those actually mean? Recovery time objective generally refers to the amount of times it takes before you're back in a recovered state. That's key. Recovery time. How long does it take before I'm back in operations? However, the other one is also critical, recovery point objective. That goes back into when was the point in time of the backup that is used that is being recovered? Do I care that I lost a day's of information? So what is the backups that I'm using to recover? Is it a day old? Is it 2 weeks old? Is it a month old? What is acceptable for your business needs to actually recover? And what is the time frame that is used to recover that data? RTO and RPO, two big things when you talk about disaster recovery and backups. And lastly, what are those trade-offs? Again, time, data, completeness, again, to me, goes back into that risk mitigation. I keep on stressing risk, because to me, that's, when you talk security, risk goes hand in hand with that. Because maybe I only want 1 minute of recovery point objective, and I want every data point there. There's a huge cost in that. Well, my finance team is going to say, no, you can't afford that. So there has to be some trade-offs. That's where that discussion comes in. So understanding what is that happy medium that is meeting all those needs from your organization, meeting the finance organization's needs, but ultimately driving there's data points that you need to meet. So again, this is what it might look like in those trade-offs. Again, understanding what makes the most sense. So how can you do that? What are some of the things in AWS that you can leverage? So you can leverage from a backup and recovery solution perspective. There's what's called AWS Backup. There's Storage Gateway. We also have an offering with Cloud Endure. There's also like some partner backup solutions. These are all great aspects. Some of these I'll mention are hybrid scenarios. What do I mean by hybrid? You can actually leverage AWS in a disaster recovery scenario where you're only using it from a disaster recovery from your on-prem data center. Why is that important? Well, maybe you only really want to address that disaster recovery like, oh, there's a flood event or Hurricane Ian came through and wiped out your data center. How do you get things back up? That's where it's understanding those trade-offs. What is the scenarios in question, the threat models, but then ultimately what are the risks you're trying to mitigate? And it might not be everything going to AWS. It might only be from a recovery perspective. So understand, is that possible? Yes, it is. What are the tools to do that? Again, going through and I'll talk through this at the very bottom. Utilize the paragraph like secure backup account structure. Why is this one down here important, and why is it listed on here? One of the biggest things for a backup aspect is ensuring that your backup itself is what you think it is, that is not compromised. When you have a ransomware event that occurs and credentials start going across and all your backups start getting encrypted as well, and your backups get deleted, I hate to tell you, but you're not gonna be recovering from anything. So you have to understand that separation, and the reason why it's in quotes, air gap like, there's no true air gap. Everything has some connectivity, but if the connectivity is minimized through least privilege, like what we talked about previously, and you have enough compensating controls in place that you've determined the risk is low enough, then that is an air gap like, and it is secure backup. Maybe you have totally separate encryption keys, and that's where I'll talk through with that. So again, different backup and recovery solutions. Again, a lot of these depend on your RPO and RTO that I've kind of dug through. I'll touch on some of those. AWS backup is one such solution. Basically, it's a container that you can kind of help think of it as a backup vault. Is a container that you organize your backups in. Basically, you can back things up from within the cloud, whether it's like your EFS storage gateway. You can back up your resources going to a separate region. For example, if you need to have distinct separation from a compliance need. So maybe you host everything in the US East region and you have things have to be separated to a physically separate region location. And separation from multiple availability zones within a region does not meet your compliance needs. AWS backup might help facilitate that, where you're copying things over to another region that is like on the West Coast. Again, still maybe meeting all your other compliance needs. One of the things that is critical from an AWS backup perspective, and this goes in with ensuring your backup is consistent and true in nature for what you think it is a WARM mentality. WORM, if my Kentucky is coming through. WARM mentality, write once, read many. So why do I say that? From a backup aspect, you want to ensure that they're there. You want to write it once, but when I do recoveries, I want to keep on reading it. Maybe I want to, ensure that the backup is, for an implementation. I want to practice it. I'm going to read it during that time for those practice scenarios. Maybe I want to validate the data. I'm going to read it then. But why is it write once? Well, again, when I talk through the ransomware aspect, if you re-encrypt the data, that's going to be another write. So that's going to be a separate and distinct backup. So you still have that original backup that you care about. Write once, read many. Another aspect that you might think about is a storage gateway. So again, this is another aspect. Again, it works with AWS backup, but again, this is that hybrid scenario where maybe you have your on-prem, services. Maybe you have colo where you have things at, and you're just leveraging as a mechanism to facilitate moving data to the cloud, to facilitate your backups. Then you're leveraging AWS backup to facilitate the backups across different regions. Cloud and disaster recovery. This gets more into the full-on, not just backups, but actual full-on disaster recovery. What I mean by the difference between those. Backups generally refer to just data itself. Disaster recovery sometimes is commonly referred to as the instantiation of business operations as well. So it's not just data, it's the processes around that, which generally include whether it's, for example, EC2 instances, VMs, the networking controls, who has the authentication to access it. It's all of that, not just the data itself. So when you think through disaster recovery, how can I really stand that up? So one of the offerings that we have at AWS is called Cloud and Disaster Recovery. Again, TCO is one thing to also call out here for an acronym soup, total cost of ownership. So again, reducing the total cost of ownership because you're only paying for what you use in the sense of as you stand things up in a disaster recovery scenario, you're not paying for that, colo that you're running 24/7 just in case you might need it the 5 minutes out of the year that you have to do your testing.
Can you talk about the backup costs, though? How often you do that also?
Yeah, so the backup cost, and so again, like that goes into the backup itself. So that's why I separate the two, backup and disaster recovery, as kind of being two distinct aspects. Generally, you always need backups to meet a lot of your needs, but it's just the backup of the data. And so what is it that you're trying to do? Maybe it's just facilitate the backups of your data that's on-prem, and your restore mechanism is still leveraging that on-prem hardware. You just need a copy of your data. That's a backup. Disaster recovery in the sense of, I need to fully instantiate all my operations, continuity of operations that was running on-prem in the cloud as well. So then you're not only talking about the cost of the backup itself, but then the cost for initially running it as well. And so that's why I mentioned like reducing the total cost of ownership, because maybe in an older legacy world, how you did disaster recovery was you had a separate physical distinct co-location site and you paid for that such that just in case, you know, you needed it that one time every 5 years, you were able to switch over to it. So you're paying for it, you know, every year, whether you use it or not. So that's where I mentioned like reducing the total cost of ownership. Is where sometimes like the cloud model helps you with that because you're not paying for that compute time all around. You're only paying for it when you spin up from a disaster recovery scenario. The backups you're always paying for in the sense of if you're leveraging the storage.
I didn't have that experience from AWS perspective, but from where I was, we were moving to Azure.
Mhm.
And one of the things, and we moved Zerto to Azure as well. So we wanted to replicate from DR perspective, but also depends on if you want to write the data, back it up very frequently, the costs are exponentially higher than pennies on the dollar, you know, or the cold storage or, you know.
I think that's where, like, defining your RPOs and RTOs first, help you set those retention policies on backups and that kind of thing, so that you're not paying more than you need to, right? Like, if your RPO says, you know, you can lose this much data, then there's no need to back up so often that you're completely redundant, like, you don't need
Sometimes the
50
client has to
backups.
say that too. You start with a different RPO and when you start getting.
Well, and then also like, you know, I don't want to put my sales hat on, but I mean, there's other avenues to reduce cost, in the sense of maybe it's the network connection throughput. So for example, what I mean by that is how, you know, pushing data up might, you know, be way cheaper or almost free to push data up. And it's how often you're accessing it.
Yeah,
And if you're accessing it
Costly.
a lot, then what are ways to reduce that? So maybe that's where like the storage gateway comes in. Maybe you have a caching aspect that is on-prem, and you're only caching the differences. And if things aren't updated too frequently, then you have your on-prem cache. Or maybe it's through a direct connect scenario in the sense that having a direct connect, you know, you have a lower cost for that access portion that is actually occurring. So there's other things that you can think through when you start talking through like what cost is a major issue. Well, is there a technical design that might optimize that? And so like previously I mentioned like from the practice, the well-architected, you know, framework, that is a good aspect to actually go through and work through. So maybe you just do a well-architected framework on your disaster recovery. One of the pillars is cost. Is there ways you can optimize and actually reduce your cost? You know, I think anyone that's from AWS will say this, like, if we can help you reduce cost, then cool. That's part of why it's in there as a pillar perspective. It's not, you know, it's better for you, great. There's gonna be customers out there that, you know, do that. So let's help you from that perspective. Sales hat off now. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah.
You're like an enterprise support customer, right? I think you have a TAM, like,
I know.
on your TAMs,
This was
they'll do
from
some of the help.
Microsoft side and,
Oh,
you know,
gosh.
starting from nowhere to going to Azure, you know, you spend months basically working with your TAM. You get into the meetings, you talk about DR, you talk about DR exercises, which is additional cost. And you talk about, of course, going to the cloud. And until you get there, you don't know what you don't know. And, you know, the first few months you realize, oh.
Yeah, I mean, so like a well-architected review, especially if you can pull somebody in to kind of come in and facilitate that discussion. And so you can have the RPO, RTO discussion, because you can go with a pilot light type cloud restoration disaster recovery scenario that might cost 5 or 10%, and it's just S3 storage effectively, more so than hot regional redundancy that's really expensive, so.
I know we're coming up on time real quick, and this is the last slide that I really want to hit on because I talked about it, which is that air gap aspect. When you talk through disaster recovery, and especially from a security-based aspect, this is key and critical. So what I mean by air gap like, it's effectively this model that you have up here. So, you know, you have your initial data that's coming over into your staging account. You have a vault account, which is, you know, that, you know, write once, read many. But then you have separate distinct accounts for like your security team if you're doing forensic operations. So for example, maybe you have a large enough team that you actually have an entire forensics team and there's an incident from ransomware, and they go through and they look at the images themselves, and we need, copies upon copies of all the, actual data itself. We look at the memory images, and they're diving in deep to understand that. Or maybe it's a separate retainer that you have with an incident response firm, and they come in and look at it. Whatever the case may be, best practice is that's done in a separate, distinct account. And why is this? When anytime you talk through incident response aspects, one of the key aspects they say is maintaining the evidence, maintaining the original copy that you had. That's why that original copy is always done in that vault account using that write once, read many. A copy is sent to that forensics account, and that way that copy is what is leveraged during those forensic investigations. You're ensuring the continuity of that original image itself, but also this can be used in the same thing for your backup stuff. And why did I mention backup as well? Down here, there's a recovery account. You go through a disaster recovery scenario and you need to recover your data. What is the right process? You get a copy of it from your vault account, put it in your recovery account, then your on-prem tools or your third-party, tools that you have, get the data from that recovery account. You're never touching your vault account itself. That is what I mean by an air-like gap mentality, where you're leveraging those models to ensure the principle of least privilege, ensuring the separation based off of the workload in question and what is actually being performed in the separate accounts. And that's kind of it. I mentioned this for minimal point and recovery time, for minimal downtime. Again, these are some services that you can leverage. Again, like managed services will help you with ransomware with patching, because the managed service takes on ownership of patching. A lot of the services themselves also have point in time recovery. Again, you can buy in, pay for those aspects to help you minimize your downtime, but also meet your operational needs from a RPO perspective. So again, there's some aspects from a managed service perspective where you get these added benefits from a disaster recovery perspective if you want to leverage it. But that's it. Here are some of the resources that are out there. Again, these are all short links, but the intent is on the AWS website. If you do want to take a screenshot of this, feel free. The well-architected framework security pillar, that's a big one I point to. The security incident response guide, that's another big one. Like I mentioned earlier on, if you're trying to set up a multi-account framework, security reference architecture. It's a white paper that's out there that talks through that multi-account approach with a security-focused lens, how to have that separation to include like that air gap like separate security account, your forensics account. It talks through those models. These are some of the services that AWS has. Again, like these might help you along with various things. So again, like that's why I just mentioned it. Tabletop exercises, I think you call that out. Some of the other things, security specialist deep dive. I'm a security specialist. That's where happy to deep dive with customers. I like security, as you can hopefully tell. Very passionate about it. So various other things that you can leverage. With that, any questions? If not, then I'll turn it over and we can do after party events or whatever is next.
I've got one.
Yeah.
So you touched on least privilege. What's your perspective